David Dayen, the executive editor of the American Prospect. David, your camera's right in front of me.
Where am I? Where am I looking? Right there?
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, how you doing? Hey, what's up? How's it going?
Welcome. Is this your first time? Not your first time in studio.
No, I've been in studio a few times.
It's the first time you've been sitting in that seat.
Well, there you go. So there's a first time for everything.
And we coordinated today. It's a casual Friday, and
it's always casual Friday, as what I was just told in the open.
There you go.
For me, it is. Anyway.
But in terms of the way that
this is dressed up Friday for me.
It really is, and we've sort of crossed paths. Let's get right into this because we've got a lot to talk about. Obviously, was there ever a busier time in the news? I mean,
my goodness. Yeah, there's a lot going on.
I mean, I remember the days when you would do the news briefs for Fire Dog Lake. That was like a
different life.
Yeah. Many moons ago. Yeah. But we never had anything with like these many sort of competing stories simultaneously.
Well, one thing I said or saw said this week was that the Democratic Party was in the midst of forgetting the lessons of the Iraq War and the global financial crisis in the same week, right? So, compressing that time along with everything else that's going on, obviously, is quite stunning.
And we're going to talk about that Genius Act, and we're going to be talking about, obviously, the Democrats, or at least Democratic leadership, and maybe even just broadly speaking, the Democrats' response to the potential for imminent war with Iran. But first, let's get a sense of what the timing is of in Iraq, we had the FU, which was the Friedman unit.
Right.
That was 6 months when everything was going to become clear at any given point.
The next 6 months are crucial. That was Tom Friedman, New York Times columnist. That was his ever-present. And it literally went on for about 5 years, he would say, at periodic times. The next 6 months in Iraq are crucial.
And the amazing thing, too, about it is you would think if it's just 5 years, that would be only 10 Friedman units.
That's right.
But they overlapped many times.
Right. Every couple of months.
It would
reset.
Be another 6 months. So there could have been something like 25 or 30 FUs during the course of that Iraq war.
Right.
Donald Trump has something a little bit more. Donald Trump has sped up the.
It's more like what my contractor tells me.
Is that right? Okay.
Right. Like, we're going to finish your kitchen in 2 weeks. There's no question we're going to have it done completely in 2 weeks.
And you're still eating off of paper plates
3 months
later.
Yeah.
Here is Caroline. Is it Caroline? Caroline Levitt at the White House briefing room or press briefing yesterday.
Regarding the ongoing situation in Iran, I know there has been a lot of speculation amongst all of you in the media regarding the president's decision-making and whether or not the United States will be directly involved. In light of that news, I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks." That's a quote directly from the president for all of you today.
There's about 45 different qualifiers in that.
Right. Concept of a plan.
There's a concept of a plan there, and we have heard the use of 2 weeks many times by Donald Trump. In fact, here is a compilation.
There it is.
That was
doing this Daily Show style.
Yeah, who put this together? We found it somewhere online. Here it is. This is maybe it's Blue Georgia that did this compilation of Donald Trump and his leaning on 2 weeks.
You trust President Putin? You know, in about 2 weeks.
In your mind, is Ukraine doing enough to get this?
I'd rather tell you in about 2 weeks from now.
Do you still believe that Putin actually wants to end the war?
I can't tell you that, but I'll let you know in about 2 weeks. I think you're going to find some very interesting items coming to the forefront over the next 2 weeks.
We've got the plan largely completed, and we'll be filing it over the next 2 or 3 weeks.
We're going to be having a news conference in about 2 weeks. I will make that decision, I would say, over the next 2 weeks.
And I'll be making a big decision on the Paris Accord over the next 2 weeks. At some point in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I'm going to be setting the deal.
Over the next 2-3 weeks. In about 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks. In 2 weeks.
You'll be hearing about it a lot more in the next 2 weeks. Maybe in 100 years from now, maybe in 2 weeks.
I will make my decision whether or not to go
There we go.
within the next 2 weeks.
It's a stalling tactic, and more often than not, people forget that he had said 2 weeks, and it gets reset. But there are, in this instance, there is a lot of movement in terms of naval activity and in terms of Air Force activity, getting set up. I would imagine Marines too, getting set up so that in the event that there is a strike, protecting the many, many bases, military assets, commercial assets that the United States has around the world. That's what he could be setting up for. I mean,
I think also, Trump certainly believes in what was known under Nixon as the Madman strategy, right? You have to believe that I'm so crazy that I'm going to drop a bunker buster bomb, a nuclear bomb, whatever it is, on you so that you'll come to the table and negotiate. And so, there's a bit of gunboat diplomacy here where he's setting up the guns, and he wants you to think that he's crazy enough to do it. So I think that's certainly part of this.
the irony is, of course, that they were in the middle of negotiations when Israel, so it's unclear to me what it is. Like, I have not heard what and also an articulation of what the roadblock was in coming to.
I don't know that there was one because it was.
Well, that's my point. It's like,
clear,
what is the?
But it's clear what happened is that Israel kind of jumped the gun. They don't want this negotiation to happen at all, and so they started bombing. And Trump saw his buddies on Fox News put a lot of neocons on saying, "Isn't this great?" and thought, "Hey, I want to take credit for that, so maybe I'll get involved." And so, I don't know that it was, I don't think the sequence was there's an impasse and therefore I'm going to start bombing. The sequence was we're negotiating, Israel disrupts the negotiation, and Trump, who has the brain of a gnat, moved to Israel's side.
And then, but what is the ask? If the theory is, it's the madman theory, I'm using this madman tactic as a way of attempting to.
Well, I think there were some impasse, not full impasses, but maybe things that were holding up the negotiation. And one is, I think, enriching the uranium on Iranian soil. I think that was one of the things that the U.S. wanted that Iran was, not willing to give up. So, certainly there are points within the negotiation wasn't over. And so having the most leverage in the negotiation, if you believe that this is what this does to Trump, means that if you start threatening, then maybe you get a better deal.
What also strikes me is the idea. People have compared this obviously to the Iraq invasion. And what strikes me is that, and you recall this, I'm sure, it was a 2-year project. Literally maybe a year and a half from December of 2001 to February, March, I guess, ultimately, of 2003.
Right.
And the machinations to build support for invading Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. There were Dick Cheney's leaking through Scooter Libby to the New York Times, and then going back and citing the New York Times on television to build this support. You had Colin Powell essentially destroy his credibility for, really the rest of his career. He spent trying to make up for this, going up and lying and holding a vial of anthrax at the UN. Condi Rice talking. You don't want the
They want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
To be a mushroom cloud.
Right.
You had Thomas Friedman going out there talking about how we were going to bring free. I mean,
the liberal hawks, they were building bipartisan support. You had Kenneth Pollock, the case for war, and there was all this other discussion. But I think you have to see this as almost cumulative, right? Because part of that was how David Frum, our friend now, right? David Frum writing a State of the Union address, talking about an axis of evil, and that axis of evil included Iran. It included North Korea,
Iraq, Iran, and North Korea.
And Iran. And so all of this sort of built-in suppositions that animated the war with Iraq are still active, particularly around we have to stop. It's an existential threat if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. That is an unstated premise that has gone through the last 20 years. So when this flares up again, you can just pick that talking point right off the top of the pile.
The difference is that the entire, it seems, U.S. intelligence apparatus, like across whatever it is, the 18 agencies have said they have no nuclear weapon program and haven't since 2003.
Right.
And so it seems like it would be a hard sell, but it also feels like it's completely almost irrelevant. Put up this poll, you can see Democrats, independents, Republicans. This is, do you think the U.S. military should get involved in the conflict between Israel and Iran? There is no party, no demographic that is a full yes, beyond 23 points for Republicans. It's 15 for Democrats and 11 for independents. And then overwhelming majorities for the answer being no. And yet it doesn't seem like it will make a difference per se.
I mean,
but I guess we'll tell.
It certainly doesn't make a difference on the Republican side, and we shouldn't let them off the hook for that. Tom Massey, the libertarian congressman from Kentucky, has a war powers resolution to say that only Congress can determine, whether or not the U.S. goes to war, and no Republicans have signed on, zero. So the realignment, the Republican realignment, is one guy on this issue. And then on the Democratic side, you have
that seems
a handful.
like almost like not a realignment.
It's not.
Yeah.
And on the Democratic side, you have a few dozen who have said, both in the House and the Senate. Tim Kaine is doing a war powers resolution. Bernie Sanders put out a No War with Iran Act. And many House Democrats have signed on to Massey's resolution. But at the top level of the party, that's certainly not what you're seeing among Democrats.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that because you and Ryan Grimm from Drop Site News and a couple other folks that you both work with did some great reporting on the dynamic that exists in Congress right now in terms of whether they're getting out there and articulating an anti-Iran war, essentially, narrative. It's becoming clear to some folks that Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries have been completely absent in terms of pressing the brakes on what appears to be, well, it definitely is the Israelis trying to bring, to pull America into this war. Beyond the fact that we have provided all essentially the weaponry that they have used so far. This piece in the New York Times by Peter Beinart, where are Schumer and Jeffries? Trump might take the U.S. to war. Where are Schumer and Jeffries? Well, we sort of know where they are.
Well, we actually know explicitly now because Jeffries, as we were going live here, Jeffries released a new statement on developments in the Middle East, is what he calls it. And it starts off with the boilerplate that you hear from a lot of members of Congress, particularly supporters of Israel. Iran is a sworn enemy of the U.S., can never be permitted to become a nuclear-capable power. Israel has a right to defend itself against escalating Iranian aggression, and our commitment to Israel's security remains ironclad. Now, he goes on to say that the authority to declare war belongs solely to the U.S. Congress, and that Trump should refrain from engaging in military action without the explicit approval of the House, and that aggressive diplomacy resulting in an agreement that permanently halts Iran's nuclear aspirations is the most appropriate course of action at this time. That is a statement that came out literally at around noon today. But you see how the sequencing is of it, that it starts with everything that Israel kind of wants you to know about this situation, that Iran must never have a nuclear weapon, and that the U.S. is steadfast in its alignment, its stance with Israel. And then it gets into sort of, the process stuff. But what it sounds to me like is that, there is this sense that because of war powers, that the Congress should be the one to authorize war with Iran, not the president. And it seems like Jeffries would be fully willing to do that as long as he has the opportunity.
As long as he has the opportunity to vote for it. We should also say, and there's a couple of things that in that statement that I find sort of fascinating. One being Israel has the right to defend itself against escalating Iranian aggression. It is so hard to wrap my head around that. Like, how is escalating Iranian aggression defined here when Israel attacked them, presumably preemptively, but according to them, but of course it was not preemptively because there's been zero evidence that they were preempting anything at all. I mean, the idea that Iran must never have a nuclear weapon, if anything, this is encouraging Iran to get a nuclear weapon, something that our own intelligence agencies have been saying they don't seem to be terribly interested in doing it.
The interesting corollary to Trump saying, I'll make this decision in 2 weeks, is Benjamin Netanyahu saying that Iran is 3 months away from delivering a nuclear weapon.
Starting in the early 90s.
That's right. He said for 30 years, Iran has been a few weeks or a few months away from having a nuclear weapon. And so you can define escalating aggression as their alleged activities towards getting a nuclear weapon, which they've apparently been doing for 30 years. They're just not very good at it. They're going to get there, but it's monkeys on keyboards apparently over in Iran. So you have to believe the kind of mania that Netanyahu has about Iran's activities in order to believe that there is any escalating aggression.
And can we talk about Chuck Schumer? It couldn't have been more than 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Putting out a video, of all the issues that the Democrats should be expending their energies on, putting out a video complaining that Trump was too close to a deal with Iran.
Yeah.
What kind of bull is this?
And that it involved a side deal and no side deals.
Yeah.
No side deals. That's the problem. I mean,
We will win.
I didn't know you were going to go full Schumer there.
Believe me, I'm going full Schumer. This is just, it is borderline insane. And you guys at the Prospect with Dropsite did some amazing reporting here on what AIPAC has been involved in over the past, I guess, couple of weeks.
Well, really, since the first bombs were falling in Tehran.
No side deals.
So since that time, AIPAC, which is, the large political action committee, they really got to work immediately contacting members of Congress and telling them, you have to put out a statement that says that you stand with Israel, that Iran must never have all the things kind of that Jeffries said in his preamble. Iran must never have a nuclear weapon. Israel has a right to defend itself against escalating aggression, and we stand with Israel. Those are kind of the talking points that Iran wanted members of Congress to get out. And my sources tell me that they were bombarding members of Congress with these messages, particularly House Democrats. And one of them got 100 calls from AIPAC saying, you have to put out a message, you have to put out a message, you have to put out a message.
So what is it when AIPAC calls a member of Congress 100 times?
Right.
What is that on their personal cell phone? Is it a text? How does that?
It could be any number of things. Yeah, I mean, I think on the cell phone. I think text of members. Maybe there's chief of staff, maybe to people in their office, their legislative director. But giving the overwhelming sensation, and it might not be from the same person. It might be from allies. It might be from donors who are allied with AIPAC. But this overwhelming sense that you have to do this, you have to do this, and so, when I heard about that, we put a bunch of people to work and said, all right, let's go to every House Democrat. Let's look at their website. Let's look at their social media. Did they do this? Did they align themselves with AIPAC and Israel by saying, by using these talking points? And what we found was that 28 members of Congress, House Democrats in particular, issued statements exactly saying, I stand with Israel.
That's an incredible coincidence.
28.
That they would use those exact talking points
words
at that exact time.
Those exact words. Another 35 expressed unequivocal support for Israel without using those magic words, stand with Israel, but giving the same sentiment. And then another 16 expressed what I would call softer support with Israel, maybe not the same inflammatory language, maybe not exactly the same talking points, but giving the sense that they stand with Israel. So that's almost 100 members of the House caucus, and was within a few days, sometimes by the next day, the day after the bombing started. That was AIPAC basically having a metric to say, see, the Democrats stand with us, they stand with Israel.
There's another way of expressing that, and it seems to me it's like, well, there's some side deals are okay.
Right.
That's crazy.
Didn't side deals end the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Side deals, I mean, we're talking about Iranian ones.
And I think there are two things to say here. Number one, this is AIPAC wanting to maintain their dominance in the Democratic Party. One of the things they did on the member statements that did not follow their talking points, that blamed Trump for his failure of diplomacy, or that said that, the Congress is the one who determines whether or not the U.S. goes to war or whatever, that AIPAC would put out a statement in response to any of those statements that fell short of those, their expectations, basically, saying, consistent pattern, J Street endorsees issue anti-Israel statements. J Street is the pro-Israel, pro-peace organization. Right. And they are jockeying for power with they don't want J Street to get too much of a foothold in the Democratic Party. And so AIPAC not only wants a bunch of statements that they can point to and say, see, they're following our lead here, but they also want to cut off the idea that there would be any support for J Street within the Democratic Party.
I mean, I think this is, I think on some level, that classic Roadrunner thing where the coyote runs off the cliff and makes it out about 40 feet or whatever it is, and is still running and doesn't realize there's no road there anymore. And I think we are, I don't know if it's a year or two away, maybe less, maybe more, of that happening in the Democratic Party. And a lot of, I think there's going to be a lot, I think that's going to end up being a lot more difficult for Democrats to be able to sort of kowtow to AIPAC, regardless of how much money they bring in down the road. And
especially if an actual strike happens and it's as catastrophic as we think.
And because, it's almost guaranteed, it seems to me, that if the United States explicitly attacks Iran, because frankly, I think it's very hard to imagine that U.S. has not been involved in these attacks in some fashion or another. But they have enough deniability that Iran can also deny to itself that the U.S. is involved. But in the event that there is an explicit involvement by the U.S., it seems to me there's no way to avoid at least significantly more involvement. And I don't know what that looks like. I can't imagine it involves, any type of ground invasion. That would be absurd. But the idea of a protracted, bombing, and then, some form of international terrorism seems to be, I would imagine is on the table if the United States start getting involved in that. And, who knows what they're, but there's a lot.
You were there in 2002 when the majority of Democratic senators and I believe a substantial number of House members, House Democrats, gave President Bush the authority to go into Iraq. And then the next year in those presidential primary races, you had Howard Dean come out very early and said, what I want to know is, that was the speech. It was the "What I Want to Know Is" speech. It was at the California Democratic Party convention. He said, what I want to know is, why are the Democrats the ones who are cheerleading for this war in Iraq?
Yep.
Why is our party collaborating with Republicans? And that really, I think, set the stage for about 15 years or 20 years of a sea change among at least a substantial faction of the Democratic Party. And of course, in 2008, who wins the Democratic nomination? Someone who was early out in front against the war of Iraq. As a state senator. At the end of the day, you are going to look back at what you did here as a Democrat in elected office in Washington. And if you kind of oppose this rush to war, you're going to find that the public really supports you, and you're going to look pretty good for a long time. And if you were in favor of it, you're going to find yourself having to explain yourself for the next number of years.
Yeah, it's interesting. If we have time, we should touch on the New York mayoralty race, because I know you guys are doing some real coverage. Actually, with Whitney Wimbish is coming out with a piece, and she, of course, writes for our AM Quickie as well as.
And now she's our new staff writer, doing a great job. And she's been focused on the race. I mean, it's GOTV weekend here.
Yes.
Like, what do you think's going to happen?
Well, wait, we'll get to that in a moment, because I want to talk about the big bill. But I do think the interesting thing we should also say about the invasion of Iraq is that starting as early as the Clinton administration, there was that similar buildup in terms of providing all of the sort of like sales pitches and whatnot that you would need to invade Iraq. But it took the Bush administration, 14 months to do it. In this instance, I think we have now been trained that the idea of the U.S. unilaterally doing this with Iran I haven't seen. We're not having large anti-war protests at this point, in the way that we did with Iran. It took months for that stuff to happen last time. This could happen so quickly that we're already involved before we know it.
That's where you started this. That it was a year and a half, build up,
sales pitch.
A real sales pitch effort. And here it's just sort of a given. Oh, we're going to bomb Iran.
Yep.
And
well, we shall see. In the meantime, there's also another a bomb, essentially, and it is winding its way through the Senate. This reconciliation bill, and you have a piece out just, I think, yesterday about what it's just going to do to not just to Medicaid. And Deborah, I don't even know if you touch on Medicare in there because of the sequestration that could potentially follow from it.
There are actually a couple things with Medicare, but yeah.
The entire sort of medical system.
Yeah.
That's going to be like, I don't know if there's ever been a single bill that I remember, at least in the 20 years that I've been doing this, that has such dramatic implications for daily life for so many millions of Americans in a negative way.
It's going to affect every American at some level. And as you've talked about, the fact that we're in this news vortex going on right now, where we have immigration stuff and protests and this Iran situation with Israel, it's not getting a lot of attention.
No.
And it's hard to get traction on it. We're doing a daily or almost daily newsletter called Trump's Beautiful Disaster, because the bill's called the Big Beautiful Bill. So we went back to the 90s with a 311 reference, Beautiful Disaster, a song by a band there. But anyway, we're covering it because of this impact, but it's been hard to break through.
Yeah.
And I don't think people realize the extent to which this will have such a massive amount of disruption, particularly in the health system. So right now, the situation is that a number of rural hospitals in particular are struggling to survive. There is a report that says 1/3 of all rural hospitals, and that's about 700 hospitals across the country, are at risk of closure right now. And if you take $1 trillion out of the healthcare system, which is kind of what this will do, mainly by cutting Medicaid, that's the primary thing, and moving 11 million people off the Medicaid rolls, you're going to get a situation where suddenly the budgets of these rural hospitals will just go into the toilet. I mean, Medicaid is often the biggest line item in these budgets. You're talking about a program that has 73 million people
For revenue.
right now. For revenue. And, some hospitals complain about low reimbursement rates in Medicaid, but there are programs that boost that are also being attacked in this bill. There's this program where the federal government will kick in extra money so that doctors will accept Medicaid and hospitals will accept Medicaid. And that was cut in the Senate bill.
That is the provider tax, right?
It's not quite the provider tax. It's a different thing called state-directed payments. But those have been attacked in the Senate bill.
Don't those provider taxes pay for those state-directed payments?
No, the state-directed payments come from the federal government. The provider tax is a separate thing that is a way for states to get more resources in Medicaid. And what happens is the state taxes a hospital. Let's say the state taxes a hospital $100. But what they say is also, we'll reimburse you more through our Medicaid program by $100. So the hospital is held harmless. They're paying a tax, but they're getting the money back. But when you increase those rates and the state pays $100, Medicaid is a federal state program. So the federal government is kicking in some of that money. So by doing this circulation, it's a way to get the federal government to pay a little bit more.
Right. Okay.
And the state direct payments are supplements on top of that. So there's two things going on here, right? And both of those are being cut by the Senate bill in particular. There are other cuts in the House bill.
Ends up being more egregious than
worse.
the House bill, which is sort of shocking.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And so what does this mean? There are hundreds of rural hospitals that are likely to have to close because of what happens in this bill. And what does it mean when a hospital closes? There are sick people in the hospital that have to be moved. And if you're talking about a rural hospital, it's probably have to be moved an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours away. And that could be life-threatening in and of itself. The second part, if you have a rural town, and they lose their hospital, it's an anchor for the community. These are often the biggest employers in that community. You could obliterate an entire town by losing their rural hospital. And then 3, for patients, now the nearest hospital to where I live is 3 hours away. If you have a heart attack, if you have an emergency situation, you might not be able to get to the hospital in time. If you have a loved one that has to stay in a hospital somewhere else. You might have to pay to go to a hotel so you can see your loved one and help them through a time when they're sick. There are real burdens for patients. And then think about the burden on the remaining hospitals. So all of a sudden, they're getting patients from a larger area.
But wait a second.
Yeah.
If you cut Medicaid, doesn't that mean that those 11 million people they get healthy and never have to go to the hospital, right? Isn't that the theory?
Actually, what happens is those 11 million people no longer have coverage, but if they're sick, they're still going to go to the hospital. And we have a law in this country that says if you are in an emergency and you go to the emergency room, that
you have to get
treated. And that is called uncompensated care. So if that person can't afford it because, they were
don't
poor
have
enough to be on
insurance?
Medicaid and they don't have health insurance, they're going to basically go and get treatment without getting paid. And that's a burden on the hospitals.
And
budget.
then it ends up being a cost that is picked up by private insurance and by essentially the public dole.
More by the hospitals, right? Because the hospitals are the one giving the treatment and not getting paid for it.
But they pass that.
Well, they
cost
asked for higher payments, but they might not be able to wrangle higher payments out of the insurance companies. And the other part of this is that more people are going to be coming in, whether they're insured or uninsured. They're going to be coming into that hospital. Hospitals are already understaffed. They already need more physicians. They already need more nurses. If you had a week wait time to see a doctor before, maybe it's 2 weeks now. And the healthcare system is very interdependent. If you have something go down in one side of it, the other side's going to be affected.
COVID. I mean, we saw how supplies had to be moved within the hospital system. If you have shut down a bunch of public hospitals, like Andrew Cuomo happened to have in the run up before COVID, there are hospitals that get overrun in terms of the burden and in cost and whatnot. And so this is going to have, and we should say that as little attention as it has gotten relative to the implications of this, look at the polling on this. Let's play this clip from Harry Enton on, is that his name, Harry Enton?
Yeah.
On CNN. He's never seen polling on legislation look worse, but it's
a soft intensity though, right? Because people don't really know about it.
People don't know about it. Is clip number, we have this. 18? Yeah. Yep. And of course, there's other elements of this bill, and but this is like sort of where the biggest chunk of money in terms of cuts are coming from.
That's right.
Where is support for this mega bill?
I'm really surprised when I look at polling data. I look at it every day. But the amount of disapproval for this bill, holy cow, my goodness gracious. And, you mentioned the KFF poll. We're talking about 29 points underwater on the net favorable rating. But that matches the Quinnipiac University poll from last week when it was 26 points underwater. Oh, my God, you need Greg Louganis to get that far underwater. And, I mean, we're talking about a negative 41 net favorability rating among independents in the center of the electorate. You rarely ever see pieces of legislation or proposed pieces of legislation as unpopular as this. But here you see it in two polls, 26 points underwater and 29 points underwater. No good.
Extra, read all about it, mister.
I know.
It's 26 points underwater.
I mean,
did this guy fight in World War II?
I don't know. He's one of the doughboys. But, I mean, this is pretty stunning, but also does not seem to have, I mean, what are the prospects? Well, let's first talk about the bird bath stuff, because there's a lot of stuff in this bill that came from the House that goes into Senate. It's a reconciliation process, which means they only need 50 plus 1 to pass it. It is not subject to a filibuster. However, there's a set of rules named after Robert Byrd, a now long deceased former Democratic and former Dixiecratic
senator from West Virginia. Yeah.
And And tell people about those bird rules and the process in which it goes through what they call the bird bath.
So this is a budget reconciliation bill, right? So in order to qualify for that special status where it can be passed by 50 votes, everything has to have a primary budgetary purpose. And it's not just that it has to have a budgetary purpose, because if you cut $10 here, then that has a budgetary purpose. That has to be the primary reason why it's in the bill. It cannot be a policy that is sort of masquerading as a budget item. And because, once this rule was established, senators got more clever about trying to reach their policy goals through budgetary means. Right. And so the Senate sort of arbiter, the parliamentarian, the famed parliamentarian, is the one who decides, nope, that actually you're trying to do policy there, and that doesn't qualify under the 50 vote standard. So we're going to kick that part out of the bill.
And the parties, the two different parties, basically go to the parliamentarian, file almost like what would be functionally like briefs.
They should put these on television. The Democrats, in this case, the Democrats, say, I raise a point of order about this part of the bill. And I say that this actually has a policy purpose and not a budgetary purpose. And then there's a debate between the Democratic staff and the Republican staff with the parliamentarian present. And then the parliamentarian eventually makes a ruling. And that ruling is that this either gets to stay in the bill or this has to go. And we actually got last night some early answers on some of this stuff. With three of the, every committee in the Senate has a different part of the bill. Three committees that have lesser parts of the bill, they got rulings. And the biggest thing is yet another kind of survival from a near-death experience for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So in the bill, the way that the CFPB is structured is that they get their money from the Federal Reserve. They don't get their money from the budget. So the question is, well, how do we ding the CFPB if it's not budgetary? They're not on the budget. So what they did was they said, okay, we're going to put a cap on how much money the Fed can give the CFPB. And that cap will be the 0% of the Fed's available resources. In other words, we're going to zero out the budget of the CFPB. Well, the Democrats challenged this and said, you're just trying to kill the CFPB. You're not trying to save money for the budget, because it doesn't save money for the budget, not directly. And the parliamentarian agreed with the Democrats, and they kicked that part out of the bill. So the CFPB will still get its current complement. There is actually a cap on CFPB resources, and it's like 8% of what the Fed has. I forget the exact number. It's like $600 billion or something. I'm sorry, $600 million. But anyway, so that's out of the bill. And to be clear, Congress can pass whatever it wants to. It's just about having the special rules
that allow
process.
You to avoid the filibuster.
That's right.
And there are a couple. There are tens of these provisions, at least, within the.
So this, CFPB is an example. There was another
artificial intelligence ban. There's a whole array of.
There's another one that got thrown out last night, which was the Republicans tried to repeal the CAFE standards for cars, which is an emissions standard, tailpipe emissions for cars, and say, cars have to have an average miles per gallon of 35 by X year. They tried to repeal that and say that would save money. And the parliamentarian said, no, you're trying to create policy, and that we're throwing.
Side note, the parliamentarian was sidestepped essentially when they essentially used the Congressional Review Act in a sort of a misappropriated way. But let's not confuse
this is
things.
a key point, right? Because this is the first time things have been kicked out of the bill. And John Thune, who's the Senate Majority Leader, has said, we're going to abide by the parliamentarian. However, as you just said, they sidestepped the parliamentarian in one previous
3 weeks
case,
ago.
just a few weeks ago.
On
and
a separate bill.
They also did it for this bill. When they were doing the budget resolution, and now we're going to get into real wonky
This is
stuff.
getting into very wonky stuff, but this is very important because we're talking about the baseline, right?
Right.
Of how we approach the tax cuts that are set to expire.
Right.
And before we get to that, let's explain this other dynamic that exists with the Byrd rule, which is it needs to be deficit neutral 10 years out from the bill. Right.
Basically, it cannot create deficits after the 10-year budget window. Everything has to pencil out after that first 10 years. You can have it spend money or be a deficit in those first 10 years, but after that, it has to be neutral.
Which is why very often what we get is tax cuts that will expire in 10 years.
Which is what happened in the Trump tax cuts of 2017. The Trump tax cuts of 2017 actually expire at the end of this year.
Yep.
And that was to make it look cheaper and also to pencil out the budget neutrality outside the budget window.
And but when we talk about baseline,
right,
even though these tax cuts must expire,
right, so there's
by
a current
virtue of their very existence, they could not exist if they weren't to expire at the end of this year. However, there's some.
So the way it goes is there are two baselines you could use. There's a current law baseline and the current policy baseline. The current law baseline is, what does the law say? And the law says that these tax cuts expire in 2025. And therefore, if you extend them, it will cost the amount of the tax cuts in 2026 and 27 and 28 and 29 and so on. If you use the current policy baseline, the current policy is these tax cuts are in place. So if they just stay in place, that doesn't cost any money because it's just the same budget baseline as we have this year. And this is a really key point because of the rules of not just the rules of budget reconciliation, but also what it looks like to the public. Does it look like these things cost $3 trillion, or does it look like it's the difference between that and the bill looking like it saves money over the next 10 years, right? So the Senate is really, really interested in doing a current policy baseline.
The Republican Senate.
The Republican Senate. And the Democrats have said, well, that violates any standard because you could just pass a reconciliation bill saying Medicare for all, but we're only doing it for 1 year. And then the next year pass a reconciliation bill that says Medicare for all permanently, and that doesn't cost any money because it's current policy.
Right.
So is that really what you want to go for, Republicans? When Senate Republicans came up against this on the budget resolution, which kind of sets the terms for the reconciliation bill, they said, well, we don't need to ask the parliamentarian about that. And they just ignored the parliamentarian, didn't even ask her.
And they left it up to Lindsey Graham, who is the...
left it up to the budget chair, who is Lindsey Graham. And he said, yeah, sure, we'll do current policy baseline. Now we're in a position with the bill itself where Democrats are going to challenge that. And they're going to have the same debate in front of the parliamentarian this time. And I think some of these other things like CFPB or CAFE rules, Senate Republicans will probably not pick a fight over that. But if the parliamentarian says that the current policy baseline is out,
that's the biggest fight.
That's the biggest fight. And there may be a situation where they ignore the ruling of the chair, which they have the ability to do. And then there's...
But Thune promised they wouldn't do it.
Thune promised, but, we're going to see the rubber hit the road once that's
the big one. I mean, because like the AI regulations could drop out. We already have people in the House. We already have a couple people in the House who already say, I regret voting for the bill with that.
Big tech is lobbying furiously for that because it would ban all state regulations of artificial intelligence for the next 10 years. And that includes a whole host of products because AI is in
everything now, supposedly.
Not only that, but it's defined very broadly in the bill. So it could be, RealPage uses an algorithm to make its recommendations on how landlords can jack up rents. That could be considered AI, and so states and cities cannot do regulations on RealPage. It has a huge set of implications.
And so those smaller things, they may drop out. We're gonna start seeing this, and this stuff is so Byzantine that, outside of like a couple of small podcasts, frankly, people are not aware of this. The big one being, though, that what is the baseline? What are we going to determine the cuts? And the argument that I saw Stephen Miller make, I think it was on Bannon. No, it was on with Kudlow, if you could believe it. Was there's no reason to expect that taxes are going to be any different tomorrow than they were today. Right. Which, of course, is like, what are you talking about? This entire bill, this tax regime was different than it was the day before you passed it.
If you extend this out, you just extend this logic out. There was a billboard on Fox News that said that this bill saved $8 trillion. And the way they got that is they said current policy baseline, that's $0. But also look at all the economic growth that this is going to spur if you extend the tax cut.
Well, that's the Laffer
which
curve.
Costs $0.
Right.
They said, oh, that's $3 trillion. That's going to so that saves the government or adds revenue of $3 trillion to the government. And then they said, but also look at all the money we're collecting from tariffs, which isn't in the bill at all. But they said that's another $3 trillion. And so they put this thing together, and it literally said that this bill saves $8 trillion.
I don't understand why they even bother to why not just put out a number and just, instead of trying to have to reverse engineer where you're getting these figures for. I mean, they're literally just numbers floating in the air, and they just shove them in there, and they're meaningless. It feels like we don't have a media, broadly speaking, that has the ability to push back on these sort of completely fake narratives that exist. All right, let's turn to one other thing that I know you've been following, the Genius Act. Mm-hmm. I feel like this is, like you say, within 2 weeks, it feels like we may both unlearn the lessons of the Iraq War and of the financial crisis. Right. This does feel like what it would feel like watching essentially the Clinton administration sign off on the repeal of Glass-Steagall, but almost, I think closer. Worse.
Yeah.
It almost feels worse because it feels like this crypto stuff is going to spread in such a way that it will be almost impossible to get a handle on it. And it's just going to run like this feels like it could be super cataclysmic, maybe in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, don't know when, but.
Well, look, I mean, we've been here before. We've seen this happen before. At the end of the 90s, as you say, Clinton not only signed the repeal of Glass-Steagall, but the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which basically says you can't have any regulations on derivatives. And within about 7-8 years, we had a financial crisis that was based on people using a lot of derivatives to make bets on the housing market. In 2017-18, the only real bipartisan bill that passed in the first Trump term was a deregulation, basically a repeal of certain parts of the Dodd-Frank Act, particularly for large community banks or large regional banks. Within 5 years, 6 years, you had Silicon Valley Bank, which was a large regional bank, completely blow up. And if we didn't have crypto isolated from the regular financial system, that probably would have been worse. But that was a mini crisis that happened. And several large regional banks went under because of that. Now you have this stablecoin bill, and the Genius Act puts a regime together, a pretty light touch regulatory regime for stablecoins. It will allow, I know you've had people on the show talking about this, but it will allow, for companies. We've now seen Walmart and Amazon say that they might put their own stablecoin together. Walmart bucks that you will use to have to pay for items at Walmart or items at Amazon. We could see that out of Meta for Facebook. You want to use Facebook Marketplace, you got to use a Meta stablecoin. You want to use X as a financial tool, you might have an X dollar that is a stablecoin. We're now seeing private currencies that are being set up across the economy. We're going to see that as a result of this bill when it passes, because, by the way, the House hasn't passed it yet. There's still more to be done. The House probably will pass it, but they might also bundle their own ideas with it, and they want to do a market structure bill, which would basically strip the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, of regulation of a lot of digital coins and give it to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is smaller and also friendlier to crypto.
Right.
So, there's still work to be done. It remains to be seen. But the Senate passed the Genius Act this week with, I believe, 18 Democrats that were in support, along with pretty much every Republican.
And that, of course, is because, almost explicitly because of the enormous crypto money. But it feels like, broadly speaking, what it feels like we have now is essentially like the problem we had with shadow banking, except for it's really just creating a whole new class of banks, but without any of the capital requirements, essentially, of actual banks. And I guess presumably allowing for all sorts of other derivatives and financial products that would come out of it on the back end and could theoretically be traded. Like you could have secondary, tertiary markets trading on the Walmart dollar or whatever they call it.
First of all, I'm so excited to have to go to every different place of business that I buy things at with a different kind of money.
Well,
that's
it's sort of
really
like this.
exciting.
It's like, it is as if, I remember in college going to Jamaica for spring break.
Right.
There were riots in Kingston at that time, so it was very, very inexpensive. But the hotel we stayed at, you couldn't buy anything with cash. It all had to be these like plastic beads. And you would buy all these plastic beads, you wear it around your neck, and then you would just pull it off to buy rum punch.
And then it's like it's a hop, skip, and a jump to workers at Walmart being paid in these.
Of course.
These coins.
And
now it's like
I
company
couldn't
script.
take that anywhere else.
Yeah.
And the real problem is that these companies are so massive and they have their own essentially economies. It could be backed by nothing and could fall apart at any point because they could just
we've seen with the stable coins that exist now is that there was one point a couple of years ago where every single one of the major stable coins was under investigation by the federal government for precisely that reason, not having enough disclosure of what they were actually backed by. And a lot of those investigations have been canceled out by the Trump administration. Right. Whose private organization has its own stablecoin, USD1, that's part of World Liberty Financial, which is part of the Trump organization. And yet this level of corruption that we're seeing with Trump's forays into crypto did not move almost a single Democrat to head off this bill. And then you had, I think maybe the funniest part of this, Adam Schiff, the senator from California, saying, I am introducing a bill to block Donald Trump from introducing a stablecoin. And he did it after voting to pass the Genius Act. He did not make it a condition of his vote.
I'm really shocked to hear that. So, what will happen to vanilla banks at that point? Like, what's the point of them? It seems to me they'll just move their operations into the bank will exist over here as this sort of some type of like side project. And their main business would be to be these sort of like unfettered by regulation banks.
One of the amazing things in my view is how community banks did exceedingly little to try to fight back against this bill. There were some community bankers in a couple states, Texas, Illinois, that actually opposed the bill and worked to lobby Congress against it. But the national group, the Independent Community Bankers Association, did nothing on this bill.
Do you think they just weren't aware of the implications?
No, I think they were fully aware of the implications, but they took a dive. And, often the national ICBA is aligned with the big banks, and the big banks don't have a problem with this because they can, they can issue their own stablecoins.
Exactly.
They can use.
They're big enough that they're going to just do a rival play.
They can profit off of trading from this. The independent banks are a really endangered species right now, the community banks, because of what might happen if this bill passes.
Crazy.
What's going on before I go? what's your call? What's your gut feel here on New York City mayor's race?
I am going to check the weather and tell you. I just saw some. I guess it was maybe over the past day or two. The early voting numbers look great from Ron Donnie.
And that's because of where they're coming from?
Because where they're coming from. They're coming from Brooklyn and Manhattan. His weakest boroughs are like the Bronx. And this is off the top of my head, but in Brooklyn, it's like 132% more.
Yeah.
All the businesses have Zoran posters.
It is, it's crazy. In Manhattan, also 132% more, something like that.
That could just be pulling forward votes. There's a finite amount.
That is correct, which is why I just checked the weather.
Right.
On Monday, it's going to be in the high 90s. On Tuesday, it's going to be 100 degrees at 2 p.m.
Yeah.
And my sense is that if we look at enthusiasm,
banking those votes is important.
Banking those votes are important, particularly for Cuomo.
Right.
Because I do not
You have an older electorate that might not come out in 100-degree weather.
And I just think that the support for Cuomo is not as intense. It may be larger,
but it may not be
but
as
it's
deep.
not as deep. Yeah. And when you have an obstacle to voting, this is the sort of the classic thing, right?
That's interesting. I mean, seeing that Marist poll that came out that had a kind of a 10-point race, very much in line with Cuomo's internal polling, it seems to me that there is a larger electorate for Cuomo at the moment.
I think,
although that gap is shrinking.
I think that gap is shrinking, but I also think that, look, I don't know how many of these voting places, when there's a line, if it's not out the door, and I don't know
in 100-degree weather.
In 100-degree weather,
right?
I've met one Cuomo canvasser. This is a completely anecdotal story. He handed me the thing. I walked like a half a block and I'm like, I wonder. And I went back and I'm like, what is it you like about Cuomo? And the guy was just like,
I like getting paid.
I
like the check that he gives me every week.
And then so I went back up to where I was going and then walked back. He was gone already.
One thing that's interesting is I just got to the area just yesterday, but the ad war that is happening for and it's all anti-Mamdani. It's not pro-Cuomo. Is pretty staggering. In fact, Zoran today went to the city board of elections and said, you have to raise the cap because the super PAC money that Cuomo's getting is something like $24 million. So you have to allow me to spend more money above the cap because of all of these super PAC resources that are coming in.
Yeah, I wonder in a primary, in 95-degree weather, how much cable television ads impact the election. I mean, I don't.
What about that globalizing intifada controversy?
I just don't think that's going to be as. I think that was already locked in.
You mean the people who are going to vote against Mamdani for that reason already were going to vote
we're already going to vote against them. And if anything, so I think the Lander cross endorsement gives a permission structure for people who might have been on the fence. I mean, I think it's really going to come down to...
You going live on Tuesday?
Well, we go live every day.
On election night.
Oh, that's a good idea. I may...
I have your ideas. I'm the one coming up with these things for you.
I mean, it's, I play softball on Tuesday nights, but maybe...
I don't want to block your softball.
But maybe I will do that live from my softball game.
Live from the dugout.
Live from the dugout.
Exactly.
Checking Twitter for the...
But I think it's really just a question of who turns out.
Right.
And I think that's a much harder, as good as these polls are.
Yeah.
And I think, like in the Marist, I think it's a very reputable pollster. I think it's very, very difficult to assess who's going to come out.
Right.
You look at the last primary, 5 people came out to vote for that in the
Adams Garcia race.
Yes.
This is going to have much higher turnout than that. I mean,
well, that's what I'm saying.
And people are more engaged.
I think it's
going
to be. I think it's conceivable it could be 50% higher, maybe more.
Right.
And there's also a lot more sophistication about ranked choice voting that did not exist that time.
Right.
And so I think it's just
right, because that was the first one. So you think like the escalation in terms of knowledge and engagement from one to the first race to the second race is pretty exponential.
Yes. And so this is, and it's also interesting, Matt's putting this up here. Let's just go through this. Bill de Blasio, who I think never, ever, ever got enough credit for, nor did he do himself any favors until he seemed like never to talk about it.
Right.
But this, his universal pre-K, which he fought tooth and nail with Cuomo over.
Yeah.
I mean, Cuomo had basically tried to put a poison pill in there that would kill it at one point, but it was so amazingly popular.
Right.
And Cuomo got significantly weaker after just happenstance after this fight with Bill de Blasio. The pre-K and 3K.
3K, you mean 3-year-olds going?
Yes.
That's what that means?
It means the last 2 years prior to kindergarten.
Right.
Are universal, are paid.
Right.
And, by the city, essentially. And it is huge. It is so massive. And I think were it not for COVID, we would see huge gains in education achievement. So,
right.
I don't know. That's, we'll see. Andrew Cuomo fought tooth and nail against that. David Dayen, I know you're going to get to lunch. Thank you so much for
thanks a lot. Good to be here.
Always a pleasure to have you on the program.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.